Neuropsychoanalysis Working Group, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's seminar, Luria's Lost Scripts, Hidden Emotions by Professor Oliver Turnbull. Alexander Luria remains one of the most influential figures in 20th century neuropsychology. He consistently emphasized the central role of emotions in mental life and brain function. Yet, as many of us know, we later learned that Luria had in fact written an entire section on emotions in the original Russian edition, only for it to be fragmented, section titles removed, and the content scattered across chapters in the English translation, obscuring his systematic thinking. Tonight, Professor Turnbull will guide us through this fascinating intellectual history and help us rediscover Luria's thinking on emotions, work that feels especially timely for those of us engaged in neuropsychoanalysis. Before we begin, I would like to express my sincere thanks to several people and institutions whose contributions have shaped and supported psychoanalysis, neuropsychoanalysis in Turkey. First, my deepest thanks to Dr. Gökçe Özkarar Gradwol, a graduate of Bosphorus University's Clinical Psychology program and former representative of the Turkish Neuropsychoanalysis Working Group, who introduced neuropsychoanalysis to Turkey and laid the foundations upon which we continue to build. She received her PhD from Bangor University and worked with the founder of Affective Neuroscience, Jaak Panksepp, while also collaborating with Professor Turnbull as a co-author. Her academic contributions and pioneering efforts have been instrumental in establishing this field in Turkey. I would also like to thank Professor Hakan Atalay, psychiatrist and member of Turkish MPSA, translator of The Brain and the Inner World into Turkish, and author of the wonderful book Neuropsykanaliz, Neuropsychoanalysis. His work has played a crucial role in bringing neuropsychoanalytic thinking into our language and clinical culture. My sincere thanks as well to Emeritus Professor Güler Fişek and Professor Barış Korkmaz for their continued intellectual leadership and support. I would also like to thank Emir Özel, a devoted and energetic younger colleague of the Turkish MPSA. He has contributed greatly to our group, not only through his resourcefulness and organizational efforts, but also as a promising researcher and academician for the future. We are very fortunate to have his commitment and vision within our community. And finally, our heartfelt thanks to Çınar Counseling for their dedication and ongoing contributions in making every NPSA event possible. Their consistent support behind the scenes truly sustains our work. Professor Turnbull, we are truly delighted to have you with us again. Thank you all for joining us. Before we begin, I'd like to remind our audience that you are very welcome to share your questions and comments throughout the seminar. You may use the chat box to write your questions, or if you prefer, you can raise your hand using the icon and pose your question directly during the discussion period. Now, before handing the floor to our esteemed guest, I would like to invite Dr. Gökçe Özkarar Gradwol to introduce Professor Turnbull. So welcome, everyone.
Thank you so much, Gamze. Welcome again to everyone. But first of all, I'm grateful to Professor Gamze Öztürmez Bilgeli for her wonderful and all-inclusive introduction. As always, she was so modest to mention every member of our group, except herself. Professor Gamze Bilgeli is an esteemed professor of ours from Başkent University, Ankara, and also an affiliate of International Psychoanalytic University in Berlin. and she contributed tremendously for the introduction of neuropsychoanalysis among Turkish experts, especially at the Turkish Psychiatry Association. And we are so lucky to have her as our representative for the Turkish Neuropsychoanalysis Group and as the moderator of tonight's event. And we are so happy to host Professor Turnbull this evening with his Luria talk. And we thank him for kindly accepting again our invite. Our group's collaboration with Professor Turnbull dates back to the onset of 21st century. And since the Turkish Neuropsychoanalysis Group was founded in 2006, he has been a great supporter for our activities. We are grateful to him for his support. So far, we were lucky to host him 3 times in Istanbul and the 4th time in Izmir at the 58th National Congress of Psychiatry. And this evening will be the 5th time, unfortunately online this time. However, we are still on the same neuropsychoanalysis journey altogether, and we are grateful for sharing this journey. So let me briefly introduce the biography of our precious guest. Professor Turnbull is a neuropsychologist and a clinical psychologist with an interest in emotion and its many consequences for mental life. His interests include emotion-based learning and the experience that we describe as intuition, the role of emotion in false beliefs, especially in neurological patients, emotion regulation, and the neuroscience of psychotherapy. He is the author of some 200 scientific articles on these topics. He is also the author, together with Mark Solms, of the popular science text, The Brain and the Inner World, and of a textbook for clinical trainees, Mistakes in Clinical Neuropsychology. He is professor of neuropsychology in Bangor University, where he is also vice provost. In Bangor, he runs also an annual neuroanatomy course, the Visceral Mind Summer School. Yes, Oliver, the word is yours. We are with you.
Thank you so much for those 2 wonderful introductions. I don't like too many compliments, but thank you anyway. And thank you so much for the invitation. It's a pity I can't be in Turkey again, but we will see what we can do. And apologies again. I know, Gotcha, I have a terrible tendency to speak very fast. So if I'm speaking too fast for our audience, then just tell me to slow down, and I'll try to follow instructions if I can. So let me see if I can share our screen here. How do we make it share? There we go. We'll try this. Oh, well, you see, I should have tried this earlier.
Share screen.
Zoom. Apparently it needs access. And now this is exactly what we should have done beforehand. Gotcha. I was saying to Gotcha earlier that I have a new computer. So, whoops. I will do that later. Okay. So you can't see my screen yet, can you?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Well,
Gamze might
Oliver-
help because she's
It looks a bit better this time.
very
This is
similar.
great.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. Oh, hang on. It asked me whether it could record. My worry is that it might not record this now. Gotcha. Are you still recording?
Yes, I guess Emir is recording.
Okay. Well, in that case, good. So, all right. Firstly, welcome everybody. As Gotcha said, I come from a small university in North Wales, where I have an administration job, but I'm also have my time split between the medical school and the psychology department. And I'm here really to talk about Alexander Luria. I have been a fan all of my life, and about halfway through this talk, I will show you how big of a fan I am by showing you an interesting document, which I hope will be entertaining. So the talk I would like to divide into a number of parts. I'll spend most of the time on the last one, but I want to talk firstly about Luria and his remarkable career. Gamze said some stuff earlier. I would like to make that clear again. I want to say a bit about his work in neurorehabilitation because I think he pioneered an unusual approach which has now become much more mainstream. And I'd like to talk about the ways in which he was correct about that. I won't spend too much time on it, but I think it's important for us to understand Luria's approach and also why he's famous, and why he deserves to be famous. And then in the last half of the talk, I will talk a bit more about what I discovered many decades ago about his book and how it took me 33 years to put that problem to rest. So very satisfying. So just a few words about Luria. He is a child of the 20th century, born in what was not the Soviet Union at the time. He lived through a tremendous amount of chaos. The revolution, the Russian Civil War in the early 20s, Stalin, the Second World War. It's an unbelievable life. He was lucky to be alive. Many of his colleagues did not survive that period. And we can speculate about some of the reasons. At least one of them was that he trained originally as a psychologist and then moved into medicine in his late 20s. And this allowed him to have a role in the medical world, which probably protected him a little from being unpopular. So let's say a bit more. He wrote more books than most people, should we say, of which the two most famous are in the center of this screen here. They are Higher Cortical Functions in Man, which is very thick and comprehensive, and The Working Brain. It's his most popular book, which came out much more widely. He also published across a very wide range of areas. No modern neuropsychologist could get away with a career studying so many different parts of the mind. We're all encouraged these days to focus on one little area and to dig deep within it. But he was brave enough and intellectually gifted enough to spread things very widely. And that includes an approach to rehabilitation, which he pioneers in the middle of the last century, partly because of the Second World War. He publishes, for example, here there's a whole series of papers on executive function, on perseveration, on problem solving, and indeed on trying to treat patients who are dysexecutive. He publishes a whole series of works and a book again on memory, the nature of memory, which brain regions underpin memory processes, pathological memory processes like confusional states and confabulation and so on. He also was very clear that about the limitations of science and the need to improve it. He felt that much science was too dry, and that a study of human beings, what it is to be a human, is not best achieved only by publishing papers that have graphs and tables on them, and that we need something that captures a bit more of the essence of humanity. And he called this romantic science. That is, in each case, and there's two that he published. I'll talk about the second one later. It's a story of a person's life, written from the perspective of a psychologist. The first one, probably his most famous book outside of psychology, The Mind of a Mnemonist. If I move this, you might be able to see the cover image. That's the one that we're all used to, which is about a patient, Shereshevsky, who he met relatively early in his career, and who has one of those amazing memories, eidetic memories, in which you can remember everything. He was seen by Luria across several decades, and they always asked him about what happened in the previous sessions, and of course he remembers everything. He does it, by the way, because of synesthesia. Luria reaches this conclusion, in which he uses the additional sensory information he has about a phenomenon to build a memory. So he says, here's a description of him remembering something. I walked into an ice cream seller, she said the words fruit ice cream, but she answered in such a tone that a whole pile of coals of black cinders came bursting out of her mouth. So there's something about the way she said it, or the words, that somehow produce cross-sensory information that overwhelms his brain, and therefore he can remember these things because it's every moment is for him such a multimodal experience. he published work in vision. Here's his pioneering work on simultanagnosia, in which he demonstrates that these patients are able to see, but only one object at a time. The thing you can see at the top, which is one of those Stars of David, he produces for the patient with two different colors, a green and a blue triangle overlapping, and the patient sees only one triangle because they use the Gestalt grouping principles in order to to segment things into a single object. It's a very impressive description here in 1959 is the paper. Probably more important for our purposes, he's systematic. He's interested in the whole mind. Here's Carl Pribram's survey. Luria has, with one well-aimed stroke, managed to bring clinical neuropsychology back into the mainstream of scientific endeavor. There's a good case to be made for him as the founder of modern neuropsychology. He's the second most cited neuropsychologist of the last century, and the first cited is an American, because they have a bit of a publication bias in that direction. So it's really systematic. And his most famous book, The Working Brain, is at the bottom here, of course. Unfortunately, on my screen, I have all of your images. Can you see those, or do you not see them on yours? Gotcha. Can you see all of your faces?
Not all, but some.
So, because for me, they're getting in the way of the picture, which doesn't bother me because I know all of my pictures. But maybe I can do it this way. Would that help? Anyway, let's see.
We don't see it.
Yes,
okay, well,
We don't see those pictures. Don't worry. If you put it,
no, that's fine.
Right.
I just need to put it so that it doesn't get in the way.
Yeah.
As long as you can see your own slides, I think no problem for us.
And I know them. So in the world of neuropsychological assessment, he develops an approach which is very different from the strictly quantitative, Weiss batteries of classical clinical psychology and early American neuropsychology, and pioneers what has since, from about the 1970s and 80s, become the process approach that Edith Kaplan in America developed. In fact, there was a woman, Annalise Christensen, who I manage in this image to have a selfie with when I look a bit younger than the elderly man that I appear to be developing into these days, in which Luria wasn't very happy with what he'd done because she had tried to make him more quantitative. And I love Ralph Reitan's paper on the topic at the bottom, which is about Christensen's book. He says this is the vulgarization that Luria always wanted. It doesn't capture what he did with his patients, but it captures some elements of it. Okay. Sorry, where else do we have? He got into trouble. This is a reason why he could have died. In the 1930s, he got into trouble with Stalin. He traveled to a developing part of the then Soviet Union, Uzbekistan, because he was interested in studying with Vygotsky, who was still alive then, the process of collectivization. He wanted to study the thinking of people who had no formal learning, no reading and writing, and those who had, and compare their approach. And the discovery, which he makes in 1931, in case you're keeping tracking the numbers, is that the people who haven't been formally educated are concrete thinkers. I've put some examples in here. On the left-hand side, you can see, the way in which they don't see, for example, a star or a triangle as abstract shapes. They see only stars. And here's the example at the bottom, which is the odd one out, of a hammer and a saw and a log and a hatchet. Now, hopefully for all of us, the three of them are tools, and one of them is the object upon which it operates. But that's not the way that these thinkers in educational thinkers are thinking. They're all alike, he says. The saw will saw the log and the hatchet will chop it into small pieces. If one of these things has to go, I would throw out the hatchet because it doesn't do as good a job as a saw. It's the thinking we see in small children and the thinking that we see in this case, in people who haven't had formal education. He went back and wrote it up in 1931, and it nearly cost him his life. Because he was seen as being profoundly anti-Soviet. Here he was insulting our Uzbek colleagues within the Soviet world. And he says, I'm not insulting the Uzbeks. I'm comparing education and collectivization and education before and after. But that, strangely enough, that nuance was lost on Stalin. And it would have probably cost Luria his life. Fortunately, though, he trains has a second training. In fact, I think he said, I was a professor in the psychology department in the morning and a student in the medical school in the afternoon. And he trains as a neurologist. So,
may I add something there just briefly? Actually, after the Soviet Union was founded in 1922, Uzbekistan joined the Soviet Union in 1924, and the Uzbeks were forced for education in Russian after 1930. And this study in Uzbekistan by Luria was done only in 1931, after 1 year of forced Russian education. And the assessment was done in Russian, not in Turkic language. And the sample was really biased because he went to a very Nordic part of Uzbekistan and he assessed, I think, 17 male, 13 female nomadic people in the tundras, not in Tashkent or Samarkand. And then he concluded that these people were cognitively impaired, kind of. So that's why I think he was criticized.
Well, it's any way you look at it, he couldn't publish it in Stalin's lifetime. And you can see at the top here when he finally did publish it, which is 1976. That's quite a big gap between data collection and publication. Not even longer than the one that I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, interestingly. So, okay. So of course, he does all this work with Lev Vygotsky, who we'll be familiar with in other parts of psychology. He's not famous as a neuropsychologist. And he died, I think, in 1936, apparently of tuberculosis, although other theories are available for his death in the middle of Stalin, Their thinking, of course, is that the mind is not something limited by the brain, that ultimately the origins of mind lie between human beings in shared collective appreciations of the world, and that if we didn't teach our children anything, then they wouldn't learn anything either. The mind, of course, for them is run by tools and signs, tools which are external objects, but these sign systems are internal tools that we use to manage our mind and are acquired, through childhood. So that's a useful way of looking at it. There's a book called A Primitive Man and Child, which are essays from them during this time period. These are organized, very important now for neuropsychologists, into complex functional systems, which seek to solve high-order problems by bringing together a number of simpler, more foundational units. So there is, as the middle part of the slide shows, no narrow localization in neuropsychology. There's no brain area for arithmetic. If you want to do arithmetic, you need to bring together a number of different regions to achieve a goal. That's very clear in his working brain book. And this also means, this functional systems concept means that a single psychological process can recruit a number of the same parts of the component systems. The example I like to choose is this thing called a quasi-spatial ability, which is a left lateralized parietal function, and is our ability to think about space, but not concrete space, rather abstract space. It allows you to tell, just to choose those examples here, the difference between your mother's brother and your brother's mother. I ask our undergraduates if they could unpack what that difference is. Hopefully we all know, but it also underpins other spatial skills like maths. When we learn that 1 and 1 together with a single unit and a tens column means that we have to add extra value, whether we go into units or tens or hundreds. That's a quasi-spatial skill, a different one to the one that we use, for example, for reading. I've got the example of B and D. Our young children struggle to learn the fact that these squiggles somehow represent completely different phonemes just by a mirror reversal of their shape. So this quasi-spatial system is involved in, I've chosen 6 or 7 examples down the bottom over here. This is the neuropsychology that underpins Luria's approach. And he also has a very clear a developmental take on this, belonging to Vygotsky as well, which is that these actions begin externalized, where the child, for example, regulates their own psychological processes through external speech, and then gradually they internalize this process so that we have the verbal regulation of behavior, as Luria talks about, so that you can't see the origins of it in adults. I'll say a little bit about neurorehabilitation. So Luria trains as a neurologist. He has interesting timing for this, because not long after he has trained as a neurologist, we have the Second World War, or the Great Patriotic War, as the Soviets would call it. And there are just a lot of neurological patients. And Luria is sent to the other side of the Urals to found a neurological rehab hospital, a 400-bed hospital, which he runs for the rest of the war, which is, of course, very helpful in him surviving into old age. And there he, as he describes it, more or less invents neuropsychological rehabilitation. That's not completely true. There are many previous examples, including some from the First World War, actually. But he feels that we need a scientifically based approach, and he feels that he's developed it by the end of the war, a rational system for the treatment of brain injury. He describes this again in Romantic Science, a different book this time, The Man with a Shattered World. This is a patient who was shot through both parietal lobes. So he has biparietal lesions, but his executive function remains intact. His name is Zazetsky, and he handwrote in little books that Luria gave to him this account of his first-person experience. So he has all these quasi-spatial failings. He can't tell left from right. He doesn't know how to read anymore. He was an engineer before, by the way, and he makes some very interesting linguistic errors. So here's an example. I had forgotten how to use a pencil. All I could do was draw some crooked lines across the paper. It looked like the scribblings of a child who hasn't learned the alphabet. So he writes this book for 26 years, by the way, and Luria, and he later published it, which is a pretty amazing book. You see, by the way, at the bottom of the title there, it has a foreword by Oliver Sacks. Sacks himself has repeatedly says in print that Luria is the thing that made him brave enough to write the stories of his patients. You know, Sacks only starts, of course, to write those stories in the 1980s, and Luria is doing his Romantic Science basically from about 1970. Okay, I'll say a few words about Luria, why Luria is correct, before we go on to the later part. I won't give us too much detail, but this is the issue. You need a systematic assessment. This will come as no surprise to anybody, but the neuropsychologist needs to understand which parts of the system are broken, and that will manifest itself in lots of different processes, because one functional system shares lots of simple component parts. Once you've done that, we can then begin treatment. And Luria's argument is that we shouldn't in neuropsychology encourage our patients to practice the thing that they can't do using the technique which they had used pre-morbidly. Those systems tend to be broken, and rehearsal of those systems is a mistake. Patients show very little gain. And in fact, there's now a modern literature in cognitive remediation which supports this argument. If you can convince your patients to put in thousands of hours worth of practice, the rehabilitation gain is pretty modest. But what you need to do is work around the system. So you work out which parts of the system are intact and allow the patient to rebuild their capability around intact systems. And of course, modern cognitive psychology has lots of examples in which there is more than one route to solve a problem. And if your patient has lost only one of them, we can use compensation techniques. Here's Luria described as a founder of cognitive rehabilitation and the soundest theoretical principles supporting cognitive rehabilitation as a viable clinical procedure. It's at the heart of modern cognitive rehab. And of course, it's entirely consistent with the World Health Organization definition of the distinction between impairment and handicap. You can have all sorts of things that you can't do in the world, like, for example, walk. But if you have appropriate compensation, then you aren't necessarily handicapped. If you've got a wheelchair and if you've got nice ramps and lifts, then you're not disabled in the same sense as you would be just because you have a handicap. So Luria is all about the achievement of a goal. So long as you can achieve the goal, then it doesn't matter how you got there. And for any of us, for example, who've worked with speech therapists, they are very clear about this mantra. For example, that our aphasic patients, who of course lack the ability to speak, but speech is not the goal of language. The goal is communication. So long as the person you're talking to understands what you want, then it doesn't matter how you get there. With gesture, with writing, with the boards that people use, it's all about actions. So similarly, it's nice if you've got normal memory, but an amnesic patient needn't be disabled or can be less disabled if we can find other ways to prompt them in relation to the future. So it's quite a positive message for our patients in rehabilitation rather than a disability-focused one. Okay. Oh, and by the way, he also is very clear that for disorders of the front part of the brain, dysexecutive impairment, all those rules don't apply. That is, these patients who are dysexecutive really have difficulty with these sorts of compensatory procedures, and in many cases, they benefit only from external regulation, from somebody else guiding them through the process, and I've shown you some examples here. So that's hopefully a whistle-stop tour to show you why Luria is so impressive, or certainly so impressive for most neuropsychologists. I'm going to talk about a few gaps. He wasn't all that good about I suppose he was good on cognition, but less good on emotion, or at least that's what I thought when I started out in the field. But my opinions have changed, and of course, neuropsychology has had in the last quarter century or so undergone this emotional turn. That's the phrase that people use. A rediscovery that the mind is not only about cognition in lots of different ways. This applies also to rehabilitation. There's less cognitive rehab now in my clinics, but much more stuff that's working on interpersonal relationships, on psychotherapy, and so on. I thought, by the way, that Luria wasn't interested in friends and family, because I couldn't find any references for those in any of his textbooks originally. And then I forgot that Luria and Vygotsky were all about other people, and I tried to look a little bit more closely at his work. For example, The Man with the Shattered World, which is full of friends and family and relationships, and the way in which Zizetsky is part of a much wider community who help him to cope. And of course, there's a question about denial of deficit. I won't say very much about that now. Okay. All right. So if you look in Luria's books, there's not very much about emotion. It was a real trouble for me, given that emotion is the thing that I care about. Certainly, if you look in the indexes although sometimes you can find a bit more under motivation. And certainly, I was well aware that Luria is dead by 1977. So he lies decades before the whole affective neuroscience revolution. And it begs the question of, was there a part of the mind that he really couldn't work on? By the way, I said I would show you that I'm a huge fan of Alexander Luria. In the 1990s, I met Jason Brown, whose picture is in the bottom over here, when I was in New York. And Jason said to me, "Do you know, I've got some Luria letters. Would you like to see them?" He was in a correspondence with Luria in the 1970s. So I said, yes, is the correct answer to that question. And at the end of our conversation, he says, "Would you like one?" So he offered to give me an original Luria letter, just because he thought it would be more important to me than him. And this is the Luria letter that he gave me. And it's the most remarkable thing. It also generated a very interesting fantasy for me, which I'll show you about. So here it is. It says, "Dear Dr. Brown, thanks for your letter. Of course, I should only be too pleased to meet with your brother, who was traveling to Moscow, and his wife during their, whatever it is, their time in Moscow. Please ask him to phone me. My private telephone number is, and he lists his number, and the best time to call is either 8 a.m. or 8 to 9 p.m. Please have my affectionate greetings, yours, Alexander Luria. I've owned this letter for decades, and here's my crazy fantasy. What happens if I phone the number? And I realize, I know what magical thinking is, but there's a part of me thinks, will Luria pick the phone up? Especially if I phone at the correct time of day, you know? So anyway, it's an interesting idea. So I hope that demonstrates to you that I'm a fan. So I published a little paper in 2024, which had taken 33 years to write, with some colleagues, and I'll tell you the story of that and maybe say a bit more about emotion in the middle of it all. So there's a problem in the Working Brain book, and I didn't know about it until I did something very strange, which was to buy a copy of Luria's book in a different language. So English is my first language, but I grew up in South Africa, where I'm an Afrikaans speaker as well, which is the sort of foreign version of Dutch. So a friend of mine, who you'll see later, Rashad Begas, who's one of the co-authors, and I decided to buy a copy of Luria's Working Brain, but in Dutch, Grondslagen van de Neuropsychologie. It's not a perfect translation of the title. And we had a look at it. Of course, I knew the Working Brain very well. And there was something very strange in there. So here, chapter 6 of the Dutch version, you can see it at the bottom. It says, de mediobasale corticale gebieden, de rechter hemisfeer. So it is a chapter 6, on the mediobasal parts of the brain and the right hemisphere. That's fine. He's perfectly entitled to write about that. Okay. Here's chapter 6 in the English edition. Sensory, motor, and prefrontal zones and the organization of movement. Just nothing like it. Not even close. Nothing to do with it. So Rashad and I were troubled by this. So we did the only thing you could do back in 1991, which is to write a letter, print it out on a piece of paper, put it in an envelope with an airmail sticker, because email didn't exist back then, of course, and send it to the world expert, who was the guy who translated it, René van der Veer, who translated the Dutch edition. So here we go. And here's the response. That's a picture of Rashad and me, by the way. So here's what René van der Veer, writing back from the University of Leiden. It came back, of course, in an email, an airmail envelope thing 2 months later. Dear Doctors Turnbull and Begas. He upgraded me to doctor, by the way. I didn't have a doctorate in 1991. I was pleased to receive your letter, which shows that also in South Africa, well-informed people are doing research on Vygotsky and Luria. And here's the third part. I've enlarged it at the bottom. He translates the book. In doing so, I noticed that several chapters from the Russian book were missing in the English edition. And not understanding why this was so, I decided to translate them myself into Dutch. So, unfortunately, there is no English version of these chapters. Moreover, the publisher lost the Russian edition of my book, which is not so important for us here. So there we are. I remind you of the date on this. It's July 1991. There might be people on this call, gotcha, who weren't even alive when that was... when it was just showing me. I'm not feeling any younger by talking about this. So
95.
So many decades, for many decades, I was interested in this, but I didn't know quite what to do about it. Oops, we've seen this already. This is the Russian version, by the way. I don't know if anyone has any Cyrillic knowledge, but of course the Russian version looks like the Dutch version because that's what René van der Veer did. He's a fluent Russian speaker. Okay. It's even stranger because Carl Pribram writes the introduction to the English edition, which has got some amazing stuff in it. There are chapters on the working brain which are less satisfactory than others. Neither Luria nor I are at all satisfied with the data on the mediobasal zones of the cortex and those of the right hemisphere. What? Why is Carl Pribram in the English edition citing chapters which are not in the English edition? It's just bizarre. And then here at the bottom is Luria's conclusion in the Working Brain book. That is why some very important chapters, such as motives, complex forms of emotion, and the structure of personality, are not included in this book. Perhaps they will be added in future editions. So, by the way, in saying perhaps they'll be added in future editions means that they're not in the present edition. Luria presumably doesn't know that he's been badly translated. He's just writing an introduction to what he assumes is a translation. And by the way, my reading of this conclusion is that Luria knows that he's interested in emotion, but not in, if you look at that middle line, complex forms of emotion and the structure of personality. That he thinks he doesn't know how to solve yet. When he does, he'll publish it in a future edition. That's my reading of it all, based on what we're going to see in a few minutes. All right, so that's the start of it all. I then sat around for a long time thinking about it and doing nothing about it until Christian Salas, my colleague and then PhD student, I told him the story because I tell everybody the story. He says, that's very interesting. And he goes back to South America to when he finished his PhD, to be a neuropsychologist there. There he meets Alfredo Ardea, the South American neuropsychologist, who actually studied with Luria. So Christian can't resist temptation. He says, wow, do you know the amazing story about the working brain? And Ardea is blown away. He also owns a Russian copy of the working brain. And he goes home and thinks about it, and then comes back to Christian a few weeks later and says, it is in the book, because he kept thinking about a particular figure image that is it's about the limbic system, which is in our chapter, but is not, is in the Russian chapter, but is not where we're looking in chapter 6. And it turns out, we discovered by unpicking, that chapter 6 has been broken into lots of component parts, moved across different parts of the working brain, completed without chapter headings, has had sections removed, has had sections added by the translator, who I'll say a bit more about later. I mean, it's quite the worst case of translation I've ever seen. So there we go. So with that in mind, we then translated chapter 6. And here we published it, which is what's available for you if you want to look later. You can see the chapter translation and our commentary, of course, afterwards. So let me try to summarize that. I won't talk about the right hemisphere stuff. It's not very interesting, actually. The emotion stuff is much more interesting. So here we go. Firstly, Luria complains about modern neuropsychology. Let's remember he's writing the book in 1973 because it's barking up the wrong tree, he says. Sorry, let me move this over here so I can read it properly. I can say with perhaps a little exaggeration that the whole of neuropsychology is in fact built on data acquired by studying the lateral cortical areas because of their role in the reception and processing of exteroceptive information, as well as in the regulation of movements and actions. That critique, I hope we all agree, you could write today, that neuropsychology has been too focused on the cortex and it needs to be more interested in areas just beyond the lateral surfaces. So, 1973, I'm already impressed. Maybe I've put this in the right or wrong order. Okay, here we go. He does, however, clearly understand the importance of subcortical structures and their role in motivation and emotion. And he cites all the right authors. By the way, this is 1973. The Americans are starting to get interested in hemispheric lateralization and the fact that the right hemisphere is more interested in prosody and emotional recognition of faces. Luria will have none of it. He correctly identifies decades before that literature becomes less important for us, that actually the secret is deep subcortical. And here we go. Time and time again, he mentions the structures of the upper brainstem and the hypothalamus, which have, he uses this word, a visceral function. He cites key pioneers like Kluver, Olds, MacLean, all of the people that Jaak Panksepp cites when he wants to talk about emotion, and points out that lesions of these parts cause considerable changes in the biochemical processes, elementary needs, and affects. So my reading here is that, Luria is absolutely right about the details. He's got the right part of the brain for modern affective neuroscience, and he's citing the right literature that are the precursors to modern affective neuroscience. The problem is that he's living in 1973, so there's a lot of stuff that still needs to happen in order for him to understand things better. And in the paper, we try to list a number of ways in which Luria might have been right in broad principles, but lacks specificity. And I'll talk about those now. So here's the first one, in no particular order this, by the way. He knows nothing, or doesn't say very much about it, about the role of emotion in decision-making. You remember in Gotch's introduction, I said I was very interested in intuition and how people have gut feelings for our choices. It turns out those are very valuable, actually, in helping us to guide complex decisions. This work, which started in the 90s with Antoine Bashara and Tony Damasio, of course, Luria is several decades too early for this. It's not his fault. I'm sure he would have been very interested in it all. I want to spend a bit more time speaking about the second one, which is, of course, affective neuroscience. Luria, oh, sorry, I'm trying to get my things out the way here. So all that work that came from the animal work that he originally cited, but continues particularly with Jaak Banksepp, he just can't see. And in particular, the idea that there are a range of basic emotions which have their own neurochemical and neuroanatomical basis is just unknown to him. So a brief reminder for us all, about what those are. They are, of course, based on evolutionarily conserved systems, starting in the brainstem and to some extent the thalamus and hypothalamus. So they are really old and shared with animals. And although they're shared together at the top end of the brainstem in the periaqueductal gray, they separate out into a number of component systems, each of which give their different subjective experience of emotion. Here's a nice diagram that Jaak used to use, which shows the human sadness system. Jaak has usefully color-coded it from the PAG here in upper brainstem all the way through to the anterior cingulate. And here, of course, is the equivalent system in the guinea pig, which is identical in its design. The only differences, of course, are that guinea pigs have got a lot less cerebral cortex than we have, and guinea pigs are quadrupeds, so the brainstem comes out of the back, but instead of diagonally, but the same principles apply. And of course, we're now in a position in which we can debate the number of basic emotions. Jaak's number is 7. Not so sure that everyone agrees with Jaak. Busy working on a paper on that at the moment. But the idea that we have multiple basic emotion systems is almost universally held amongst emotion neuroscientists. Here's a bit of added extra detail on that, which is the hierarchical arrangement of these systems. So just to go back a few earlier slides, as Jaak shows in the numbers at the top over here, you get the largest emotional change for the smallest voltage by stimulating upper brainstem. And as you go forward towards the cerebral hemispheres through areas like the anterior cingulate and the amygdala, so the effects are less powerful and the system becomes more specialized. So it's no longer about the experience of emotion, but, for example, about emotion memory and so on. I think I have the next slide. That's more or less on that topic. There's lots of things we could say about inhibition and so on, but I particularly want to focus, because our research has been on that, about emotion regulation. So although Luria talks about the importance of the cerebral cortex for cognition, it's also important for emotion in these ways for emotion regulation, not the experience of emotion, but its management and containment. And in fact, by the way, that's a very Alexander Luria idea. The idea that the frontal lobes, that executive function, can be used some of the time for complex problem solving, and at other times for the management and regulation of our feelings. The idea of one brain region involved in multiple psychological processes is exactly the functional systems concept that I was talking about 40 minutes ago. So I say a few more words about our translator, Basil Haig, a British doctor who spoke Russian and spent time translating books, including other books by Luria. I have not investigated that topic, but sometimes I lie awake at night wondering what else he might have done. I thought quite hard about writing the last paragraph on this page when I published the book, because I didn't want to be sued by his son, who wrote the obituary in the British Medical Journal. So here's my delicate phrasing. It said, unfortunately, Basil Haig is no longer alive. He died 20 odd years ago, because the issue of his working brain translation would make an interesting interview question. I think for English speakers, using the word interesting is a way of sweeping something under the carpet. I don't know what I would say to him if I met him, apart from what's on earth, Okay. This is a slide I could have showed earlier. We enter the area, this is Luria talking, of problems that have hardly been studied and for which we have means that are clearly insufficient, taking into account I just need to move this so I can see, their close connection to the structures of the upper brainstem and hypothalamus. We prefer to refer to these structures as the visceral brain. I mean, that's, you could write that today and it wouldn't be an appropriate statement to make. Luria, by the way, was very shy about his own role in things. He had this opinion that people are transient and that only ideas remain. So this is Cole writing about, who wrote the biography of Luria. When my wife Sheila and I first read the manuscript of this autobiography, we were forcefully struck by the absence of all personal information. The march of ideas and experiments were presented in a vacuum, in accord with Alexander's philosophy that people are transitory, only their ideas and actions are of enduring interest. So he really cared about romantic science when it came to other people and writing about memory experts and people with a shattered world, but less so in relation to his own life. I think he was just being very modest. And here's a sort of a feeling for the nature of his work. Ivenga Homskaya was his successor in that role in Russia, and compares his contributions to psychology with Mendeleev's in chemistry, and of course Pavlov's in physiology. So truly a remarkable guy for all sorts of reasons. Okay, so I think we're about on time, Gotcha. I hope that hasn't been too fast speaking, and that I've covered more or less the things that you were interested in me talking about, Gotcha. So thank you very much.
We thank you, and Gamze will moderate the discussions.
Yes, it is really very interesting why the translator chose not to include this phenomenal aspect. It is really hard to understand.
Of all the things to choose, it is surprising. It might be that he wasn't very interested in emotion, and he just was more interested in the cognitive stuff. I don't know. Also, he doesn't delete it; he just moves it around. I've in the paper I say that the 1970s was a different era for translation, but I think even in the 1970s, if I was translating, I don't know, Homer or Dante, I wouldn't just move some verses around. That's not the way translation works. So anyway, it is very interesting. But it was a window in for us to discuss, what things looked like to Luria in the 1970s, and was he prone to the same biases that the rest of the field was? And he wasn't. He was very prescient, actually, in in being interested in the hypothalamus and calling it the visceral brain. It was very forward-looking, especially considering that, this was very late in his career. He was 70 at the time. So,
Yes.
right. Any
Well,
other questions? How are we doing?
yeah,
I'm
of
happy to
course.
take as many as people would like, if they'd like to put their hand up. Or if not, I don't even know what time it is in Istanbul. Probably.
9:30.
Oh my God. Okay. Well, you can go to bed if you've got no questions. That's fine.
Barış Bey, we can't hear you. You're speaking, but
Yes,
we can.
yes, you
Barış
can
Bey.
hear now. I may have some questions if you allow
Of
me.
course.
This is a book, Working Brain. I bought it in 1982.
Wow. Excellent.
So I have been studying Luria and Vygotsky since then. And I thought that as you said, the medial-basal portions of the brain are included in different chapters, especially the unit for regulating tone, waking and mental states include these areas. And this is a revolution in the sense that MacLean has a strictly layered understanding of the human brain, reptile brain, old mammalian, and new mammalian. But he shatters, he proposes that the lower parts of the brain are involved, the higher parts of the brain, some parts of frontal lobe is involved in the basic functions of the brain. It's not a hierarchical organization, but it's a functional organization. This is, I think, one of the important things we have to keep in mind. And the other one is, I would ask your opinion. This is again a book of Luria, the nature of human conflicts, and emotions are included there.
Yeah. It's one of his first books, actually. I think it came out in 1927, before he trained in medicine.
And under the influence of Pavlov, because very physiological.
Exactly, and it involves squeezing as a measure of the strength of emotions, which is quite an innovative approach. Later in his life, he said it was the precursor of the lie detector test, which was I think was interesting. Of course, Luria had always been interested in emotions, not least, I should have mentioned his role in psychoanalysis. I don't know if you know the story, but or if
it was criticized by Vygotsky that you should not delve into the details of psychoanalysis.
Yes, but he wrote to Freud. As a young man, he wrote to Freud and said, "Can I set up an institute?" And Freud wrote back and said, "Carry on." So he founded it in Moscow, and then was forced to denounce it. I don't know if you know, but that he has an article in the Great Soviet Encyclopedia or something, in which he says, "This is my summary of psychoanalysis, but of course it's all bourgeois and doesn't fit the new Soviet worldview." But you had to write like that, in order to stay alive. I don't know. Sorry to segue into another free association of mine, but at the time you had to cite Pavlov. So I know how Luria solved this problem, which is that if you read the first few pages of, for example, The Working Brain, you will see some Pavlov references.
That's true.
Because Luria knows that the censors will only read the first few pages of any book, and you won't see any Pavlov for the next 300 pages. But it's the first few pages have done its important work.
Yes.
So,
and strange enough, Pavlov is not very fond of the regime. He's also had some other views.
Well, exactly. It must have been a terrible time to have tried to work as a scientist or a clinician, and those of us worried about the present start to think about about interesting similarities. So yes. But thank you very much. And you're right that Luria isn't hierarchical in the same sense that MacLean is, but components of a functional system are very much his approach to things. So thank you very much for that. And sorry for free associating on other Luria topics. I'm like you, I've been a fan for a long time. Do we have any other hands up?
I think I saw Professor Akbaşoğlu's hand, maybe.
No, actually, I did not raise my hand, but just thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk. I just remembered the time that I was working at Crownsville Hospital Center, an asylum and mental hospital, which is now closed in eastern United States. Luria, Nebraska was the standard test back then. And I didn't know until recently that Luria was not a fan of standardizing. And this thing, actually, I'm sorry to take your time, but this limbic music by George Murray it ends with the sentence, "The limbic music never lies." And I use this in my lectures most of the time. So just something to back up Luria's
That is
approach.
very interesting. Luria had Goldstein, I think, is the author of the Luria, Nebraska, and Luria had nothing to do with it. He didn't even like Anneliese Christensen's. I mentioned it was a vulgarization. I suppose the problem is that Luria's approach, which involves, it's like detective work, and you need to custom design every assessment based on the patient's deficits, is harder to train people for. And I think there was a time in which the Americans were enthusiastic on the standardized battery approach. Modern neuropsychology has become increasingly integrated with neurology, so that and scans mean that you don't have to localize a lesion anymore. So it's I think things have moved on a bit. I don't know whether the Americans still use the Luria, Nebraska or not. But
no.
Okay, well, there's the answer, I suppose. On the question of limbic music and their truth-telling nature, I mean, I think it speaks to the power of emotions. They are strong. Emotions are potentially overwhelmingly powerful, and the lesson that I think the mental sciences can carry to the rest of humanity is that sometimes faced with a choice between a powerful lie and an uncomfortable truth, people tend to default to the lie, the false belief, because it's just more comfortable for them. And increasingly, when I watch my television set, I see examples of people who seem unable to see reality because they strongly want to hold an alternative view. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, but or maybe you're protecting your mental health by not watching television, which is also a good strategy. Any other takers, Gamze?
Not yet, but my free association, there's this book, The Shattered World, right? And it is as if the translator, the English translator, in a way shatters the, I don't know.
Yeah, no. It is interesting, and you're right to come back to it, because I've never seen another example of a translation error of this kind. And for those of us who work in emotion, it's particularly frustrating that it should be in this, in this, special part of the world. If somebody else has enough time to study other books which Basil Haig of Luri's has translated, maybe this was a habit of his, and it just so happened that I ran into the easiest example to find. So, on the other hand, if it had been translated as a chapter, I would have given it a lot less scrutiny. So I'm viewing it as a positive that it allowed us to put it, it was a special Luria edition in Cortex, which that paper was published in. So it gave a chance for us to talk about Luria and emotion in a way which, I found very helpful. And you know, I've been a fan of Luria, as you can see, for a long time, but I hadn't read those sections properly, not since I knew what affective neuroscience was. So it would have been frustrating for me, or less than ideal, if my hero had got it wrong. It would have been understandable, but you know, it would have been, but to realize that he made the correct, he reached the correct conclusions based on a lot less information than we have in the modern world, you know, it was very reassuring for me. And you know, if Luria made any other guesses about other things, it would make me more likely to believe that he was a good predictor of the future, which is handy. But yes, it is a shattering, at least for that. You know, it was very bizarre. In fact, I originally thought, Gamze, that he just omitted the chapter, the same conclusion that René van der Veer had reached, you know, and then we could have speculated, you know, because he forgot it was a typo, it was deleted or something. You know, we've all made mistakes like that. But what he did was very deliberate. You know, we talked earlier about the pages. It's on about page 250 in the original version of the book. And it's moved in the working brain, the emotion stuff, to about page 60, I think we'll find, when we have a copy of the working brain handy there, I see. And the right hemisphere is moved to about page 160, I think. So one part's moved by 100 pages, and the other part is moved by 200 pages, and the text is changed. Stuff is removed. I mean, if you have a look in my in the 24 paper, you can see there are times in which you have to say, well, this paragraph's removed, and this paragraph actually says this, and it was really quite a task, you know,
Yes,
just
kind of
piecing
a
together
puzzle.
the jigsaw. Yeah, exactly. But it was a fun jigsaw to fix. Like all good jigsaws, I enjoyed doing it very much. Right. Any other takers, or are we about done, do we think, Gamze and Gotcha?
If I have some time, I would like to thank first for this marvelous talk. It was amazing. And yes, the limbic music of Luria was muted, and you somehow unmuted it by finding all these hidden scripts of him. I don't know who telephoned him, but I think a magical thing happened and he spoke via you, let's say. We also thank him for including emotions in his masterpiece, The Working Brain. And it was a great pleasure to listen to you tonight. I do always believe that the zeitgeist of the world influences the publication world and the translation world a lot. And somehow maybe that British translator was also from the cognitive behavioral camp. So he didn't like those lines regarding the emotions and the right brain, and he used his own initiative to omit these parts. We will never know that. It will remain as a mystery. But as I said, if there's a synchrony between the microcosmos and the macrocosmos, there was Cold War in the time when Sperry and Gazzaniga did their split brain experiment, and the world was divided into two by West here and East here, and they were like, ah. And then Sperry and Gazzaniga said, let's cut it and check what is doing right and what is doing left. And in late 1960s, by the onset of 1970s, the world acknowledged again, oh, the right hemisphere is also doing something, and emotions. I also support MacLean's triune brain model, and I'm a limbic system fan. I believe in the archaic subcortical affective systems role that Panksepp defined. However, I think after the Cold War ended, the world slowly, maybe the scientific world maybe, slowly got used to the idea of diversity and emotions and culture as well. That was the last association that I had in my mind. I thank you again for this marvelous talk, as always.
Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure. It's always nice to see some familiar faces as well, and perhaps some new ones. And I meet my translator of the new book, which is also lovely. It's and I hope I get a chance to come and to spend some time with you in Istanbul again. Wouldn't that be lovely?
We guarantee you that Emir translated your book word to word. Nothing
really?
is missing.
You didn't move any chapters around. That would be funny. I look forward to it. Maybe, as you say, for the book launch, if we're going to have, it will be the first translation of that book, which would be very helpful. So wonderful.
We will be happy to welcome you. Gamze and me, we will think about solutions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, everybody. Should we leave it there? And I hope you all
Anytime
have a
you
good evening,
like.
and give my best wishes to everyone in Turkey. I wish you all the best.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you.